Hello, everyone. My name is Ariel Mosley. I'm a postdoctoral research scientist at Columbia University. And the work I'm presenting today was conducted throughout my graduate career with my graduate advisor, Monica. The title of my work is Claiming Outgroup Cultural Objects and Spaces, Appraisals of Cultural Appropriation in Intergroup Contexts. So I always like to start out with a really clear example, and a recent one with that. So cultural appropriation has been a topic of debate for decades, but it emerges in the news and in the media as a phenomenon that is a hot topic. And there's often a lot of debate about it. This specific example depicts social media celebrity star Kim Kardashian and how she had created a fashion line and called it Kimono. And after receiving a lot of backlash, she actually lost $10 million, having to rename and recreate her brand, which shows this isn't just a social phenomenon, but it has really important economic consequences as well. And so the purpose of this work was really to uncover what is cultural appropriation? Can we understand it from a social psychological perspective? How can we understand intergroup relations against this backdrop of societal inequities? And so to do that, a definition pulled from communications, indigenous studies, art, philosophy, and law, which basically comes to a consensus that cultural appropriation is essentially a case of outgroup cultural use, when a person engages with a cultural product from a group that they do not necessarily identify with or sort of belong to. And a cultural element can sort of vary from more symbolic things, rituals, to more concrete things, dress, hairstyle. And so not only is there sort of ambiguity or sort of a continuum of the types of cultural products, but like I sort of alluded to earlier, there's sort of a disagreement about whether or not something is cultural appropriation or not. So the research questions that this research is addressing is, A, how do people even conceptualize active cultural appropriation? What is sort of this lay understanding of appropriation? And B, how does power relations and group status of the actors and the source community involved, how do they influence these perceptions? And so to sort of answer these questions, I pulled from different sort of parts of social psychology. So cultural psychology to pull from this perceiver group status hypothesis, such that dominant and minority groups, they occupy different socio-political positions. They have different experiences. They sort of exposure to different racial knowledge. And this backdrop that they grow up in, this cultural discourse, creates a different understanding of what a sort of what happens when the participant's background, how does that influence perceptions? Another sort of body of literature that I brought into this, because like I mentioned, there was nothing in psychology when we first started looking at this. We also looked at the social cognition literature, the prejudice literature, to see, okay, so if this particular participant is likely to see an act of cultural appropriation, what about the actor involved? What about the person actually engaging in the act of cultural appropriation? What does the sort of the status or the background of the actor, what does that have to do with how people see appropriation? So that sort of alluded to our second hypothesis in this work, the perpetrator prototypicality hypothesis, that suggests that higher status actors are more likely to be viewed as perpetrators of inequality. So that was the second hypothesis that we sort of brought in. And so the first three experiments really address these two predictions. A, that minority groups are more likely to see acts of cultural appropriation than high status groups because they're more apt to experience the inequalities and the negative consequences of that appropriation. And B, that high status actors who engage in cultural appropriation are more likely to be accused of appropriation compared to low status groups. And then finally, we have a little bit of a social identity spin on this because we wanted to understand the why. What's sort of the driving reason behind the fact that I sort of alluded to it a little bit in terms of like the experiences of inequality and sort of being closer to it. But we also drawed upon the distinctiveness threat literature, which suggests that people are motivated to have a good sense of self. They define the sense of self in terms of high value. And when you can't necessarily define yourself in high value, groups engage in social creativity strategies such as distinctiveness. Maybe my group is not high status, but it's different and it's creative, and that is able to sort of establish the group of identity. An out-group member engages in cultural elements that represent your group in your low-status group, that can be particularly threatening for your identity. So those are the predictions going into the work. So the paper that I'm presenting is a 5-study paper. The first 3 experiments are very similar, so I'm going to present the results all as one. But like I said, the methods and the results are pretty consistent across these 3 experiments. And then present study 4, which shows what happens when we manipulate distinctiveness threat. And then I give a little flavor of some ongoing work about group identity and privilege and how endorsement of a white identity also influences perceptions. So the first 3 experiments of this paper, we look at the race of the participant. We have Black and white participants, and we manipulate the race of the person engaged in appropriation. Are they a white actor engaged in Black culture or a Black actor engaged in white culture? I think I might have flipped that, but I'll show you some examples. And we have a bunch of different scenarios of appropriation as well. And these 3 studies were pretty much consistent across samples, but they were all online MTurk. And for the procedure in these 3 experiments, participants were either randomly assigned to read about white perpetrators or Black perpetrators. We did so by having them read 4 to 8 blog articles that sort of mimicked what you see in the news of, hey, this person did this behavior, they were accused of appropriation, sort of, what do you think? And we assessed a series of dependent measures. I'll only talk about 2 for the sake of time. I mentioned, we had a variety of scenarios so that it wasn't just limited to like one case. Makeup, hair, music, parties, literature, art, costume, all of these taken from real life scenarios from social media, matched in terms of content, wording, everything is the same except for the race of the actor. Here's an example, a Black actor wearing sort of blonde hair extensions, or it's a company, Black-owned company selling blonde extensions, or it's a white-owned company selling sort of dreadlock extensions. And these are sort of all pre-tested to sort of show that these are sort of viewed as appropriative. And in terms of the dependent measures, we assess perceptions of appropriation. This person is appropriating, copying, taking from Black or white culture, match the condition. And then a measure of distinctiveness threat. It's not right that cultures are treated as if they're the same. And so, like I said, these studies the results are sort of collapsed across the 3 experiments, but the findings are consistent and converge across the 3 studies. And so across the studies, we find the same pattern, where it's particularly the white perpetrators engaged in Black culture that are viewed as appropriative, but it's the Black participants that are saying, okay, it's definitely this group. And that pattern was mirrored with distinctiveness threat, such that when Black participants read about the white perpetrators, they were particularly likely to indicate that their distinctiveness was threatened. And in a moderated mediation analysis, we show that distinctiveness threat mediates perceptions of appropriation. And when you split it up by participant race, we see that the mediation model is not significant for white perpetrators. It's not significant for Black perpetrators. And so in study 4, we had manipulated distinctiveness threat to see what happens if we get white participants in that sort of state of mind. And so we manipulated distinctiveness threat. We used the same, we used a created manipulation of perpetrator race so that it wasn't taken from real life. And then they completed perceptions of appropriation. Example, they read an article that says in subsequent generations, racial and ethnic groups in America will become culturally indistinguishable from another, or a control article about like geography and climate. And this is an example of the perpetrator race conditions. And essentially in the control condition, we found the same effects across studies where it was the Black participants who indicated that it was the white perpetrators that were the most appropriative. But in the distinctiveness threat condition, that race difference goes away. And white participants are likely to say that the white perpetrator is more appropriative than the Black perpetrator. Whereas in other previous studies, they equate the two and they say that the white perpetrator and the Black perpetrator are the same. And so that is the results that I'm going to present for that paper. But because I wanted to just put a little flavor on privilege, we have work, I'll just say it really quickly because I know I'm out of time. Also, the QR code here is on the left if you want to take a picture and read more of the paper. But because we talk about white privilege in this symposium, I wanted to just show what happens when white participants are highly identified with their white racial identity, and we ask them, okay, how do you see the white perpetrator condition and the Black perpetrator condition? And we find super interesting pattern. So if those who are low in racial identity, they look just like the Black participants, where they say the white perpetrator is more appropriative than the Black perpetrator. But as they get higher in white identification, their white identity means more to them. They equate the two as Black and white perpetrators as equally appropriative. Not only as equally appropriative, but equally justified as well. The Black and white perpetrators are equally justified. I don't have the data here, but the paper we're writing also shows that they're viewed as equally harmful and equally racist, which shows this moderation effect of white identity, which shows this equating effect, this colorblind effect of I'm not going to think about power or status when it comes to my perceptions of appropriation. I'm just going to see appropriation as an act of outgroup taking. So that was a lot in a little bit of time, but the overall takeaways is that my work is very much interested in bringing cultural appropriation as a worthy phenomenon of investigating in social psychology and studying empirically. Combining different perspectives of racism, social identity theory, social cognition, we show how power influences how people see appropriation, where it's high status actors that are viewed as appropriative and low status perceivers that are more likely to see things as appropriative. So we show this evidence for the perceiver status hypothesis, the perpetrator typicality hypothesis, and the distinctiveness threat hypothesis. And then I gave a little flavor of the group identification moderation that we're also about to submit soon. So I want to thank my PhD advisor, Dr. Monica Burnett, and our collaborator, Dr. Glenn Adams, both at the University of Kansas, and my current lab, the Social and Moral Cognition Lab at Columbia University. You can read more about this work at my website, arieljanemosley.com. I'm on Twitter, or you can email me. Thank you, everyone.
We have some questions. We can start with, who would like to start? Ariel?
Hi, sure, thank you. Thanks for messaging me the question. Great to be in intergroup distinctiveness into this topic. How do you explain the differences you found in the mediation analyses between white and Black participants? Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I didn't have enough time to fully go through it, so I kind of jabbered it. But just as a refresher, we had participant race as the X distinctiveness thread as the mediator, and then we were looking to predict perceived cultural appropriation, and we looked at how perpetrator race sort of moderated that. So the conditional indirect effect of participant race on appropriation via distinctiveness threat was not significant when the perpetrators were Black. But when the perpetrators were white, taking from Black culture, that conditional indirect effect was significant. And then we had split it up to the simple mediation effects. So we looked at only the white perpetrator condition. The Black participants compared to the white participants, they showed greater distinctiveness threat, which in turn predicted perceptions of cultural appropriation. And then in the related model, the conditional indirect effect of perpetrator race on appropriation via distinctiveness threat was significant when the participants were Black, but not white. So basically, the Black participants are reading these scenarios about white actors taking from their in-group, they reported more distinctiveness threat, which then predicted their perceptions of appropriation. So the more they were threatened, the more likely they were to say, okay, this is appropriative. Those effects were not significant when they were reading about Black perpetrators. In addition, those effects were not significant for white participants. So it's a really interesting story about the race of the participant, the status of the participant really matters for how you're reacting when you're seeing higher status groups sort of appropriate and exploit your group, and sort of because it's so threatening, according to this model, it's sort of driving these perceptions of appropriation, and they're saying, to the extent that this is threatening my identity, this is appropriative. And so really interesting sort of effects there. And then as I sort of mentioned in study 4, when we had manipulated distinctiveness threat, that sort of eliminated the race differences altogether, which is providing more evidence for that perpetrator race effect, perpetrator prototypicality, or perceiver race effect, there's a lot of P's, perpetrator prototypicality effect, and then that distinctiveness threat, which draws on the social identity literature, which really talks about identity as that sort of fundamental component that's sort of driving things. Thank you so much for your question.